Welcome to Strategic Product Management, and more generally, decision making in business. Why should you care about this talk? Well, I think the decision making is the basis of leadership, and great decision making is the basis of success. Now, this matters to me personally because I've lived through more than enough failures earlier in my career, as documented in a book I co-authored called Agile and Unexpected Journey. There it is. However, I've also observed from afar the failures of other big corporations, and all because of poor decision making. I mean, this isn't just the usual Kodaks and blockbusters. We've covered that ground enough times, right? Failure is still happening. And in this talk, I've got two examples from 2024. One in the tens of billions of dollars. These are all self-inflicted disasters that could have been avoided. My name is Craig Cockburn, and I'm based in Edinburgh, in Scotland. I'm here to help you improve how you work, to avoid poor decisions, and to improve your organisational effectiveness. I hope this talk will help you, whether you're a leader or whether you're somebody who helps leaders. Now, this talk was first recorded in Romania in September 2024. The introduction to that talk wasn't recorded. However, this new introduction helps you to just dive straight in to when I get going and start talking about not only decision making and the importance of it, but also the importance in the social media age where a bad decision can gain traction really quickly. So I hope this talk helps you. Thank you for watching.
And particularly now, in a world of social media, it only takes like one tweet from Elon Musk to say we're buying back Tesla, or particularly in the world of product management, a bad review from an influencer on social media, and all of a sudden, a problem has happened. There's a bad phrase with some inexpletive words I won't use, but that's what happens in the world of social media. So the cost of mistakes is only getting higher. So what can we do about that? Now, as we know, in 2001, 17 people got together, there were only men, sadly, to have the Agile manifesto. And the Agile manifesto came out of software. That's its origin story. It's now being used in places beyond software. Many of the practices I'm going to talk about today, some of them are already being used in Agile. Many of them have come from the military, but that's its origin story. It's not confined to the military, and the intersection of the two, I'm talking about so that that intersection can get bigger, and you can take advantage of literally battle-tested techniques. So in this talk, we're going to talk about some of the problems that we're facing just now, some biases in decision-making, referencing the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, who talks about these sorts of things, about how we often jump to the quick decision, how critical thinking can help in decision support, so we make better decisions and faster, and then relating that to the world of Agile. How we would then go about implementing critical thinking in our work, and I'll talk about some of the tools, some of which you're already using, but the tool set in itself is much bigger than perhaps ones you're currently using, how they categorize and how they're applied and the benefits that they bring, and also some feedback from actual customers that have used these practices and found them to be effective. And then at the end, there's a wrap up and your chance to give me feedback. And who's the key audience here? Well, there's a bit of product going on here. Product managers, heads of product, but also coaches helping them. But I kind of think it's a bit like strategy. It's a bit like quality. It's a bit like customer focus. Really, it's for everybody, right? So although there's a slant there, if we all have an interest in good decision making, whether you're in a Scrum team, how do we approach our work? How do we plan the sprint? How do we make decisions in a more practical, faster way? And in doing so, in employing these practices, we actually get better psychological safety because that's a cultural outcome from doing the right things. So just making those a bit more prominent there. Practical tools for real problems. So what is the problem? Well, let's start with how things are with Agile just now. What state is Agile in? What's the data that's supporting that? And we're not just going to look at the State of Agile report. I'm going to draw it much wider than that, 150,000 directors globally. We're going to look at what that tells us, what can we do about it. This is the latest State of Agile report. It's been out for 17 iterations, and many iterations says much the same. There's not much inspecting and adapting going on there, I'm sorry to say. And a lot of these are related to leadership. Similar themes, and this isn't the only survey saying much the same. Now, I'm not going to blame leaders, because that would be negative, and I'm here to be positive, to say, well, what can we do about that? But this is the sort of talk that if you're on LinkedIn, you're seeing this sort of thing quite regularly. Agile is not in a good way. The coaching market isn't doing so well, and many people are struggling to get work. And this is the sort of analysis that's coming out of that. There's too much certification. There's too much sort of fluffy stuff, and there's not enough delivery. Well, that's one person's perspective. Now, I look at that sort of thing and I go, it could be of interest, it could be something worth talking about, but is it actually going to address the problem that the surveys are telling us? So the problems with Agile are brought out by being issues often associated with leadership. The opinions of Agile are about too many certificates. The proposed solution does not address the problem. Non sequitur, the Latin for this does not follow. And that is a logical fallacy, which is an aspect of critical thinking. In the corner there, I've got, courtesy of London Underground, mind the gap. And that mind the gap is another critical thinking practice, which we'll come on to later. Just a teaser there. So what do you think? Now, this is the tech bit that might not work properly, but we'll see if it does. If you open up your phones and go to ahaslides.com, easy to remember 1000Y, and give me your views of what you think are the main challenges here, because rather than relying on multi-year-old data, I always like to get the feeling in the room. Because of the technology of doing this, I'm going to just read this off from my laptop, but we'll share the screen afterwards. So I've now opened up the thing, so you should be able to submit your answers. And I'm seeing the answers emerging on mine. So I'll share the screen later, but it's slowly coming together. Yeah, there's a lot of people. Thank you for all your contributions. It's really great to see such engagement with the talk. So if I just read some of the things that have come out so far, we're not agile, we've forgotten what it is, different ways of doing it, devalued, speed. Wow, the screen's changing so quickly, I'm actually having trouble keeping up there, but they're very interesting. And you can continue to contribute if you want, but I'll move on very quickly. What I'll do is I'll grab that screen. Got it, right, so I'll share that later. Now, this is a conversation on LinkedIn between David Marquet, who was an award-winning submarine commander who turned the ship around literally from the worst performing ship in the fleet to the best in 8 months. And Bryce Hoffman, who I work with, who wrote the book Red Teaming. And David Marquet has been on Bryce's podcast. And we can see a similar pattern here, that the organizers are often inclined to blame the doers rather than the deciders that put them into that situation. There's the link to that conversation on LinkedIn. And this is coming from an established leader who led a team on a submarine where obviously people have died in submarines. It's a mission critical environment. So there's been leaks from nuclear submarines. It's incredibly regulated and safety conscious. And yet he succeeded in that environment. So this is the first practice. I'll introduce some of these practices as I go. There's too many to talk you through all of them. But just say, look, argument dissection is one of the practices. This helps clients evaluate and consider the validity of information. And certainly from a product management perspective, we are often asking people what they want and what they need, but does that need address the real problem? So this is about looking at the argument for doing something. Does it make sense? And does it have any logical fallacies like the one that we saw earlier, or biases, or other weaknesses? Now, in this, there are 16 questions you can work through, but the very first one, does the argument address the real problem? And it didn't. So again, you can just work through the steps to find out for yourself. A related practice is 6 strategic questions. Now, a lot of this thinking was developed by the military. They have published it. It's out there and it's free to consume, but has been readapted for business purposes, which are explained later. But of the 6 strategic questions, the first 3 were advanced by the military, and the latter 3 are more in a business context. How might that look? But if we take that, you'll see how powerful it is. What's the problem we're trying to solve? Is it Agile certification? And is this the right problem? If you were to solve that problem, what would it be like? Would it be any better, really? And if you do this, what are you choosing not to do? If you're investing all your time, energy, and emotion in solving that problem, that's time that could be spent doing something else. Now, there's a couple of Nobel laureates who make an appearance here. This is the first one, Thomas Schelling. And of course, it's so obvious, isn't it? No matter how clever you are, you'll never come up with a list of things that would never occur to you. I mean, it's genius from a Nobel laureate, but it's so obvious. And this is about why we don't just need one person making all the decisions. We need good, constructive, collective thinking such that our ability to not see stuff is diminished, right? Because we're getting different perspectives, and that obviously enhances diversity. We want diversity, and through that, we actually want diversity of thought. People from different backgrounds, people from different classes, people from different countries, people with different linguistic backgrounds. And when I was learning different languages, I started to see from that perspective how having a different cultural perspective gave me additional insight that I didn't have before. So diversity of thinking is really, really important. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I was going to touch on wider things, not just Agile. I'm in the Institute of Directors, and they are an organisation in the UK, but they've collaborated with 24 other organisations globally to identify across 150,000 directors what the problems are at board level. And that's, of course, from small companies right up to big multinationals. And again, there's the link. You can research that later. I will send out the slides so you can refer to them. Now, in this, there's a lot of writing there, so don't try and read it. It's too small. But there's 6 key themes. So the headlines. This one is about strategic dialogue. This one is about decision-making, and they want it to be better. And if you just focus down on that one, that's about inclusion, which if we get good, effective dialogue and decision-making, it makes inclusion happen because we ensure that every voice in the room is heard, and not just the loudest, not just the grey-haired middle-aged bloke, not just the chap who's the senior person or the senior person. And I know that in different cultures, that seniority can play out in different ways. But we do want people to feel that their views are valuable, irrespective of gender, race, or position in the organization. By embedding these real practices, it can affect that as well. I mean, thinking about the military, if the new recruit out of college was up there challenging the general, we know how that would end up. So let's not go around blaming leadership. Leadership accepts it has problems. We want to help leadership. It's a difficult job. But some additional tools could help them and address the problem. And through them being used by the military longer than since the Agile Manifesto in 2001, in fact, some of these practices go back hundreds of years, since the time of the Prussian conflict with Napoleon, which is where the term red teaming came from, because the Prussians in blue simulated being the red Napoleonic army. So they've already been proven to work in the military, and they're already being used in business. So again, scapegoating coaches and bad implementations might not help very much. Another practice, so this is the third one. So 4 ways of seeing can help. And in this, we look at things from 4 different ways, which is, how do we as leadership see ourselves? How does the Agile community, as an example, see us? How do we see the Agile community? And how does the Agile community see itself? And in that first example, we've got how does the Agile community see itself? But in the second survey, we've got how do leaders see themselves? And just asking those 4 different questions gives you that, put yourself into that persona to go at what would that persona do. So you can see commonalities, you can see differences, you can perhaps see opportunities. And the other practice, of course, that I've not mentioned there is think, write, share, which you did as part of the first exercise of you thought for a bit, you wrote it down in the Edo slides, and then I shared it. And that way, in doing that anonymously, I deliberately didn't put up the answers there, because in doing so, when the first one appears, a lot of people then anchor on that one. But by not sharing the results, I got the full diversity of thought in the room. It's a practice that's widely used in retrospectives. So that's an example of one that's already in both domains. What I'm seeking to do here is to increase the overlap of the 2 practices. This is a quote from probably the world's leading coach, Marshall Goldsmith. He is extremely successful as a coach and as an author, and he's now directly referencing red teaming as a business practice. So he has worked closely with Alan Mulally, who I mentioned later. Alan Mulally turned around Boeing after 9/11, coincidentally, today's the anniversary, and also turned around Ford, such that Ford was the only company not needing a buyout at the time of the credit crunch. And then Alan Mulally sat on the board of Alphabet. So very, very successful award-winning leader. And he and Marshall have worked closely together. Both are advocates of red team as a decision support tool. So now on to the next question for you. It's the same URL, so there we go. So that's opened up. So now again, back to you. What issues and challenges do you face making decisions here? I've given you some starters, but please don't be biased by me leading you on. Please contribute your full experience and knowledge in the room. Again, I'll take a screenshot. It may be useful for the program, but it's also useful for you to then have conversation topics in your retrospectives. This is the sort of thing that does come out. That's opened up now, sorry. Yeah, I can see the answers coming in, thank you. And I've made it deliberately short because we even see just through a few words or short answers. It doesn't have to be long or complicated, but it gives us a sense of the direct issues and problems. So I'll give you a couple of minutes so I don't lead you on with any of the answers so far. The screen is nearly full. Thank you. So we've got not empowered, technical hurdles, higher up want to approve all the decisions, lack of clarity, that's a really good point, I'll come on to that in a second, shifting goalpost, comms. It's really terrific. I mean, thank you. It's valuable. I mean, I know I'm external, but I'm going to send this in, and hopefully the Agile program will be able to make use of this. But thank you for your contribution. Now, touched on earlier biases and decision making. There are pages you can go to that show all the biases. There's such a large number that if I put them up on a slide, you wouldn't be able to read them. They're very well documented. But a few powerful quotes can make all the difference. So groupthink is one of them. Somebody comes up with something, it's easy for everyone else to agree. Now, of course, this is from kind of a World War I era. Starts of World War II is involved as well, but General George Patton, I think somebody's not thinking in this room because you're all saying the same thing. And recently, this was only a few months ago, the same problem came up in respect of COVID planning in the UK. So this is a problem that's still very fresh and relevant, in which former Prime Minister David Cameron at the time commented on groupthink in the decision making. And then the Health Secretary then had to apologise for group thinking. And then the COVID inquiry itself talked about groupthink. It was probably the key finding that everybody had thought in a similar way that COVID would pan out in the same way that flu did 100 years ago. And they were wrong. So they planned for the wrong thing. And that was expensive, costly, lives, and obviously affected the economy if you can't get on top of COVID quickly as well, because the equipment wasn't ready. So what do we do about groupthink? Well, I've just mentioned think, write, share. So you've been doing that. That's, again, a practice that's already used in Agile. But taking it on now into the newer ones, devil's advocacy. Well, actually, devil's advocacy isn't that new. It originated in the 16th century. And its backstory is that it's a real thing. The office of the devil's advocate was created by the Pope, Pope Sixtus V. And that's a tongue twister for another time. But he brought that practice about because there was too many applications for sainthood. It was just apply for your local church to have its own saint. There you go, have some money, right? Well, there's too many demands for that, too many saintly festivals, and too many demands for money. So by employing a scientific approach, which would be quite a surprise for religion to do that, to say, could there be a rational explanation for these miracles? The number of applications for sainthood went down. Although there was more bureaucracy, it actually cut down the applications and did its job. And expanding that slightly from just taking a deliberately contrary position, one of the other practices in red team thinking is about on the contrary, which expands that out a little bit wider with saying, well, is there a spectrum of possibilities? Is this true under all circumstances? Is it the only explanation? Could there be other things? So it's a more nuanced version rather than just taking the diametric opposite. Now, in a world in which data is important, and again, this is another recent example. Now, I used to work actually for Full Tilt Poker back in the day, 2009, and data was king. You know, the page load times in milliseconds, you could almost track that in terms of customer signups, and data has only become more important. We live in a very data-driven world, and Nike recently employed some external consultants thinking that they didn't have the knowledge in-house, and these external consultants would give them all the answers. And they employed this flywheel model about data, and they dropped their vision, which wasn't about sustainable growth anymore. It was about customer loyalty. Now, loyalty matters, but it doesn't drive growth. It just stops attrition. And so I just can't, right? Just do it. What happened? That happened. And that's only a few months ago. Look at those numbers. That's not a small amount of money. When they announced the results, their stock lost $25 billion in a day, which was the end of a slide of $70 billion in 9 months. Decision-making can be a very expensive business when you find out late. Better to find out early. So those big red numbers are really big and red because $70 billion was actually bigger than the whole size of Nike not that long ago. This is like an extinction level event. They could have been the next blockbuster. They survived it, but this is about, the thing is, often in organizations where you've been around for years or even decades, the experience is in the room. Why are you paying external consultants more than your board to come up with answers when the experience is already here? They outsource their thinking to a third party, and look what happened. I believe that the experience of an organization is within that organization. It just needs brought out, and that's a cheaper answer than employing a third party to tell you things that end up going badly wrong. So what I think is, although data is king, and data without insight can lead to disaster. I just touched on Nike there, but there was also New Coke back in the 90s, in which lots of surveys and lots of customer feedback sessions said this new Coke tastes better. They rolled it out, and it was a disaster. And it was a disaster because they didn't look at the insight of there was a strong cultural, historic identity with Coke that wasn't being captured in those sessions. And people then felt when they rolled out is, oh, this is different, and I kind of like linger for the old taste. And I know this is better, but there was this sort of, I suppose, intangible cultural history to it. And so ultimately it was an expensive mistake and they rolled it back. So to me, there's a balance here that although we're living in a world of data and AI, data tells us how it is now. The insight is what is the research telling us right now, and the analysis, which is how could that future unfold? And of course, there may be multiple pathways. It's not just about, oh, it's that, or that's a roadmap, or an agile release train going on the tracks that direction. There's no deviation. It's about, when I was talking about strategy, now this is probably about 60% likely, this is about 30%, this is about 10%. So you're kind of at least considering it could go different ways and not presenting one single answer. When Donald Trump was president, he stopped a practice, and that practice was the CIA giving him advisory analysis, which said, we believe that this is the case and this is what's happening right now. But at the end of that, they would say, however, this other thing could be true. And this is up to you, Mr. President, to make a decision what you want to do based on the fact that we're not completely sure. It's probably this, but it could be that. He found that quite hard, and he stopped it. And he also wound up the red teaming school at Fort Leavenworth too. So perhaps if there's a different president, which there will be obviously after November, we might see a resurrection of proper analysis and thinking at the highest levels. So Agile Manifesto, right? This is the very first value, and deliberately so, because it focuses on individuals and interactions, which is absolutely key. You know, a lot of the time in Agile, we're talking about hard skills, you know, the coding, whatever. Two of the values are actually about people and how they get on, you know, customer collaboration and individuals and interactions. Half of the manifesto is about soft skills. It's probably why it's lasted so long, but it's often not emphasized. But they took a world in which processes and tools dominated and said, that's still important, but the shift is more to the stuff on the left. But look, I mean, I'm using a mic, I'm using a laptop, I'm using a mobile phone, we're using feedback tools, we're using a projector, we're on Zoom, DevOps, right? Or where would we be without tooling? It's absolutely critical now to get the insight at the speed we need. So I say the tooling is the essential foundation, and the individuals and interactions are the necessary soft skills to take that foundation further. Therefore, both are needed, not necessarily one over the other. They're both complementary skills that both add value. So therefore, it's both the analysis and insight and the data and tools. So here's our second Nobel laureate, Daniel Kahneman, certainly just passed on. And his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, won him the Nobel Prize in 2002 for economic thinking, in which he said that our brain works, there's two systems. System one is the older brain, which does things in parallel, like balancing, talking, all the automatic things that we've learned, regulating body temperature, balance, so on. It can do lots of things in parallel, and it's incredibly fast. Just think trying to balance on one leg, how quickly you have to react to that and keep stable or riding a bicycle. It can do stuff in parallel, it's fast. And it evolved at a time when it was fight or flight. Terrific at that. System two is a lot more work, and that's the cognitive load. And that can only do one thing at a time. And it's slow. And so what tends to happen is, I think the statistics say that most of our thinking is at least 95% the first one. And if you are in a situation where you're trying to think about something using system two, but your system one brain tells you what the answer is, you're kind of default to that because it's easy. And so this is about consciously using system two when you need to overcome the biases that system one brings, because it likes to be fast. So now bringing this to critical thinking and decision support. I talked a little bit about how this came about with the Advocatus Diaboli. Sorry for the Latin again, but that's the Office of the Devil's Advocate in the Vatican, recently used to validate sainthood. I think it was Mother Teresa. So it's still there. And then, let's say, the red team name came out of Kriegsspiel, which is used by the Prussian army when fighting Napoleon, and helped them by doing battle planning simulations. So against for decision support, what could the future be? What do we need to think about and prepare for? More recently, the Yom Kippur War, Israel in 1973, they were completely unprepared and didn't think it was going to happen. And it did. And so they adopted the Ibcha Mistabra technique, which means, on the contrary, the opposite must be true, which is what they call the 10th man principle, which means that if there's 9 people agree with something, the 10th person needs to come up with a contrary but plausible explanation that needs to be properly considered. That practice was then used in World War Z by Brad Pitt as to why the Israelis were successful at combating the zombies. So a bit of zombie culture coming into this talk here. If they do anything to advocate red team thinking, that's obviously a good thing. Even if we don't encounter zombies, then it's still useful, right? And latterly, and sadly on today's the anniversary, the day after the attacks of the 11th of September 2001, the very day after, two actually big things happened. The CIA director formed the Red Cell, so there was better thinking in the US government. And I became a father. So my daughter was born into a new world in which different practices emerge and are important. So it's like, wow, big steps, big changes. What does the new world look like? And what responsibilities do we have, not just to ourselves, but to the generations that follow us? And now, I know that the military sometimes gets a bad rap, and sometimes things have gone really badly wrong. I think like the pullout of Afghanistan was one, and how the Libyan war was managed was another one. There's been lots of military failures, but there's a really important distinction here. The military advises and analyzes and gives recommendations, but it's the commander-in-chief, the politician, that makes the decisions. And they make decisions for political reasons and being re-elected and budgets and so on. So if there's things that go wrong, it's not necessarily the military's fault for that. And it's important. It's like in COVID, the advisors advised and the politicians decided. So from my own point of view and how I got into this, I was giving talks on strategy in 2019. And avoiding failure and visualizing that. I went to an introduction to red team thinking in March 2020 when we were busy washing our hands with hand wash and thinking that would be a good thing and save us. But in that session and using pre-mortem of what's the worst that could happen, and envisaging anarchy, which didn't happen, but the steps towards that, envisage anarchy, you work backwards, 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 progressively less anarchic to the present day. The first step that I said was there'll be a second wave of COVID. And the second step I said was there'll be an increased lockdown that's worse than the first. And not being a virologist, I was surprisingly accurate, which shows the power of using the right practices, can bring out the knowledge in the room, even without requiring experts in the topic. Used those practices at Agile 20 Reflect when I was part of the red team, and we decided not to take big money from big corporates. We wanted to remain free and independent, and did so. I've given talks on critical thinking at Napier University in Edinburgh, and recently I did an exercise in the COVID recovery plan for the NHS, which again is a novel thing moving at speed. So now looking at how this relates to current thinking in Agile and why this is relevant. Product ops, which is gathering the data to help product people make decisions and facilitating that process, is a significant and important area. So I'm going to show how this aligns to critical thinking, as well as a few key quotes. Now, this is a leading book. There's a lot of text there, but again, the highlight, what I did here as a quick win, is you go to Kindle and just say, what are the areas that people are highlighting? What resonates with them and what's important? So I picked out the top three. One was, we want to improve the quality of decision-making, which was on page 30. The other one was about supporting strategic decision-making, it's down here. And the third one was about supporting the people who decide. And this is key, because this is not about red team thinking, making the decisions for you. It's about surfacing the information and using the practices such that the decision makers that are already there make better decisions, because you're supporting them. So to me, there's a clear compatibility here. We want to improve the quality of decision making. We want to surface the right information for decision making, and we want to support the process better. Therefore, leaders become more effective. So, implementing this, there are a few basic ground rules. One is, don't pretend to be super smart and have all the answers. Don't go around with a special hat on your head or whatever. Don't just be collegiate and supportive rather than be actually critical. I know it's called critical thinking, but if you are too critical, you won't be taken seriously. So the other thing is about top covers. Unless the act of challenging leaders has a leader to support it, then we know that this probably won't end well. You'll be seen as an inconvenience and you'll be ignored. So having visible top cover, a champion, is critical. And when the army in the US did a £250 million exercise in wargaming, that's $250 million with real warships. They did red team analysis, but they kept on changing the rules such that the Americans beat their fictitious enemy. Well, that's not how it works in real life. You can't just change the rules to make yourself win. You have to respect what the analysis tells you. And if you're not prepared to respect that, then you're just wasting your time. It only works if you act on what is found. It does make sense to just do this proportionately rather than all the time, because it can be quite time consuming if you did it all the time. And maybe it's more for the bigger decisions. And also how you operate. Maybe change the people doing red team and red team thinking, change the practices, change the order, think about it and constantly reevaluate, a bit like a retrospective. And yeah, I mean, there's no silver bullets here, but if you're wrong the whole time, that won't look very good. But the fact that you're helping and assisting would likely improve your ability to make better decisions. And don't give up, right? It's like learning anything else that's new, and it can be work. This is from the book by Bryce Hoffman. I've got a books list at the end. So again, it's not consulting. It's not coming with the answers. It's drawing out the experience in the room. Again, more of what it's not. It's not about developing a better plan. It's about taking the existing plan to highlight weaknesses so that the plan becomes better. it's not about deciding the course of action, because it's about helping the people who decide so that they can make better decisions. And again, it's not negative. It's not about attacking people or pointing out mistakes. Again, the thinking here is similar to retrospective. The more positive intent you have, the better the outcome. It's a safe space. And by practicing these safe spaces, you embed the psychological safety that everybody's been talking about since Project Aristotle and Google in 2012. So onto some of the tools. I've already mentioned some. Now, just to show that the military is already using this, and they categorize this in 3 different ways. And you see for the roadmap, it's not step 1, step 2, then step 3. It's a bit like the OODA loop, which isn't a loop. It's about understanding what to do next and then evaluating, reflecting. So you might move backwards and forwards, and you decide based on context and where you are. But broadly, you can see that a lot of the practices divide up into analytical, imaginative, or contrarian. I'll explain that in a second. In which, here's 3 examples of analytical, in which I've already mentioned 6 strategic questions and what that's for. I've talked about assumptions challenge. An alternative futures analysis is the new one here to say, look, for internal things that are going on in a company, like maybe difficulty hiring staff, you look at an important aspect from an internal perspective, and you also look at an important aspect from an external perspective, like the economy or COVID or something out there that you can't control. Because when things go wrong, it's usually a combination of events. So what you're looking at here is the internal one goes well, the outside one goes badly, or the internal one goes badly, the outside one goes well, and so it's all 4 permutations. So again, you're using 4 dimensions to the problem to put yourself into that persona to see how things could unfold, to look for commonalities and opportunities. Under imaginative, pre-mortem, already quite widely used, and that's what we used in the COVID analysis to say, oh, how could anarchy unfold? And again, it was useful. Dr. Gary Klein came up with this. He redesigned the White House Situation Room after 9/11 because it was found to be ineffective as a decision-making place. It didn't have enough space, didn't have enough ventilation, didn't have the right comms. So that was his practice to say, how could things go badly wrong? And how do we then identify the preceding steps to see actually how far along that road to disaster we really are, and making that visible and transparent so people have a clear and honest conversation about it. Influencer engineering is a type of stakeholder analysis where you map your stakeholders in a 2x2 grid to see which ones are valuable to speak to and which ones are simply generating noise. And Swan Dive is a look at an event, either good or bad in the future, that could happen. But if it did, this is like Black Swan, except we're preparing for it, right? Many of the Black Swan events weren't, because there were events that we simply chose not to talk about. But this is about imagining a future significant event and what might be the first and second order consequences of that future event, good or bad. But then working backwards to say, for that event to occur, what then would be the preceding actions? And you end up with a bit of a tree structure, right, going both ways. But you're seeing commonalities that you might need to look out for, and you're seeing commonalities in the outcome and things you might need to prepare for. So therefore, you're anticipating things earlier by having the right conversation sooner. And contrarian techniques, mentions devil's advocate. Devil's troika is an enhancement of that, in which you take a plan, you then get another team to enhance the plan, and then you get another team to look at the enhanced plan from a different point of view, and then you pass it back to the original team for comment. And that way it goes around 3 different teams with 3 different perspectives to then say, well, these recommendations now come out, what do you choose to do about them, and is that important? Us versus them is just something like a debate scenario where you could choose to set up different teams to just argue different points. And the enemy within is a really almost devious practice. And the preamble for that is to say, imagine you wanted to sabotage a company. The 2 rules are you can't use violence and weapons, and you have to act in a way that you can't be discovered. So getting people to think about that and then come up with what would you be doing is a very good way to then say, but are we doing any of that now? Are we actually destroying ourselves without realizing it by undermining our goals and objectives? And where these tools actually add value is around dimensions of clarity. So we're agreed on what we're working on and why. Capability, so we practice these things and get better at it. And constantly questioning and asking ourselves to look at different perspectives. And culture. By doing the first two, it affects the third, because we are embedding psychological safety by using the practices that make psychological safety work. Tying this back to the problem that we showed you earlier, there's the issues of the State of Agile report, and of the 7, we've got alignment on 4 of them already, so they connect to a real problem. And I also mentioned Mind the Gap earlier from Transport for London. This is where there's a business plan or proposal, in which in any plan, there's often key decisions that have already been made, like buy versus build, or do a takeover or don't, or this cloud provider or that cloud provider. What are the key strategic decisions? Use the wisdom in the room, the people that build the plan. What decisions did you make that were principal to the plan that you're proposing? Look at the plan from that point of view, and then look at the plan as implemented. How will you achieve the goals, right? What are the stated goals of the organization? And now look at what the plan is saying you will do to see whether the plan as described will actually realize those goals. And obviously, if you're using things like OKRs, you'll be measuring it. But to start with the plan, say, well, if it did do that, and that was brilliant, would it actually have got us to our goal or not? So what happens is you then get a productive discussion around, are we going to have a successful plan, and bring that out sooner than earlier? And it looks a bit like that. So across the key dimensions, top to bottom, the green dots and the blue dots, look at the differences between the plan as implemented versus where the organization needs to be, so you can spot the weaknesses earlier. So now, a list of the tools. These ones you may well have encountered in Agile already, but as I say, there was an overlap to start with. Connections about the type of problem that we have, how do we act, and think, right, share, using retrospectives. Pre-mortem, I've talked to a lot of people in product who already use this practice. And to add to that, I'm now going over the talk to bring in the topics that I introduced in each section of the talk. So in section 1, I mentioned these 3 tools. In section 2, I added in a few more. And then in the analytic tools, where there's 3, some of them are mentioned already, I've added those in there. And then the imaginative tools, and then finally the contrarian tools. So you can see the tools start to really build up in extending well beyond what you may already be using in Agile. I didn't mind the gap as one by itself there. And then there's a whole lot of others that I didn't have time to cover. So there's an extensive set of tools here that you employ the right tool in the right context to help you make decisions better. Lies we tell ourselves is one I was thinking about doing here, but it's very powerful, and I would want to do that when I'm reading your client well, because lies we tell ourselves is the corporate, bullshit perhaps, of we say this, but we actually do something else, in which a bank might say, we put our customers first. And actually they don't. Because if the customer wanted something and the regulator said no, who do you think could win? The regulator comes first. Right? So maybe the customer comes second. Well, what about the shareholders? What about if they wanted something? And then the customer, let's face it, if you put customers first, you give away free money. Come on, it's just marketing, right? When you have the honest conversations about how we function as organizations, that's probably the most powerful method to bring out really what's important here and how we should work. But I would only really use that in a client that I knew quite well, and to get the buy-in of leadership first, because often in a room of silence where nobody wants to speak up, If the leader says, yeah, that's a lie, it's broken the ice, right? Referring to the earlier talk, right? Just break the ice. The leaders go first, and everybody goes, yeah, it's cool to call that out. So to wrap up and conclude, I know I'm getting on with time. So some feedback from actual early adopters of this in the world of business as it started to emerge out of military. It's the world's largest bank, so pretty cool that they're on board. Pivotal moment for them. And taking it away from big corporate regulated finance, there's a breast cancer charity. So I just picked that up. It was only 59 minutes before on LinkedIn, and I grabbed that screen grab. I thought, well, I'll have that because it's so really cool. And this is Alan Lally, who I talked about earlier, the subject of American Icon, a top business bestseller, and turned around Ford, turned around Boeing, and Director of Upper, and he also won Chief Executive of the Year award. So key notable people in the world of business are taking notice and saying this matters. Here's your failure list, which you've probably seen some of these before. The thing here, though, is many of these failures are self-inflicted. It wasn't about our usual conversations about what's the competition doing. These were shooting the foot exercises, right? In which, you know, Polaroid had the digital camera, and Kodak knew about digital cameras, and you know, Blockbuster had the offer to buy Netflix, and Yahoo had the offer to buy Google, and the list goes on and on. The future is sitting in front of you, and you've just turned it down, and you will go bust because of that decision. And, you know, I lived through some of these, right? It's in a book called Agile, An Unexpected Journey, in which I wrote a chapter of it, and it's on Amazon. I'm listed as a co-author. I lived through some of these disasters. They're really painful. I worked for Digital, that was the world's leading network company. Just think what they would be in the world of the internet. They didn't see the PC coming. They got bought by Compaq, who then didn't know what to do with digital, and then Compaq suffered, and then got bought by HP, and then nobody talks about digital anymore. And then I worked for the Scottish Tourist Board, and tourism was obviously a big thing for Scotland. But then somebody decided that would be good to outsource to the private sector. And that business model was fundamentally flawed. It's a public resource and a public service. And ultimately, I got laid off, and it got taken into public ownership again. And then I worked for Full Tilt Poker, and then that didn't end well either, because after the redesign that was involved with the site, a year later, some internal issues came to light, and they suffered a few internally inflicted problems too. So constantly looking at what are we doing internally really counts. So a few actions for you after this talk, because I like to have a session in which people go away with some stuff they can do next. So just look at your plans and look at the feedback that are shared from after the talk on you know, what issues you highlighted. So look at the plans and look at assumptions in the plans and thinking, well, how could that go wrong? And how would we know early? And that's the critical difference. Early detection and setting up the systems for your product ops to succeed by detecting early. And that's the tool set. Poker colors. So and presumably over time we'll add to this as well. Now, some books if you want to explore a little bit further. Red teaming is the main one on these practices. The difference between red teaming and red team thinking is that originally the thinking was to set up a different team. But that was a key lesson, that moving that from the military to business didn't work very well because they need their own cost center, they'd be subject to pressures of budgets and so on. So the principle is to embed this as a practice in teams rather than having a separate team. The logic of failure talks about how we have a few models of how people collaborate and how it ends in disaster if we're not careful. Turn the ship around and David Marquet. And this is one of my colleagues on the course that I did, Colonel Kevin Benson, who planned the war in Iraq. And he talks at great length here about the analysis that happened and why that was ignored and why it was a failure. So the thinking here, and that's one of the reviews, he was a clear strategist And it wasn't through lack of planning that these things failed. And again, at the end, product ops from Melissa Perry. So thank you. There's my contact details if you want to reach out to me later. I've got LinkedIn, I've got my YouTube. There's Red Team Thinking. I have got you. If you did want to pursue this, there's a discount code. You can take a picture of that. Key quote there from Bertrand Russell. And at the end, another chance for some feedback on what you thought of this talk. So I've got my own personal view thought, but of course, you're encouraged to share your views with the organisers too. But as a refresher, and if you've got any questions, that's the key things that we covered. So that might prompt you for any questions you might have. Thank you.
We've got a question in the room, so I'll hand the mic to Petty.
Hi, Craig. So thank you for the speech, really inspiring. You mentioned outsourcing thinking in your speech, and I was curious to find out what do you think are the main reasons why businesses usually outsource thinking when it comes to going through major transformation programs?
That's a very good question, and I think that there's a tendency to avoid taking ownership. You know, if you get in a really big prominent name, I won't list them, I'm not here to advertise, but one of the big consultancy groups, you could say, well, if it worked well, management takes the credit, but if it didn't work well, we can blame them. And so management is kind of covering itself. And there's also this illusion of grandeur to say, well, yeah, they've got the experience, like they've done this before. They've been involved in these other ones. Look, we've seen the case studies on the website without necessarily probing deep, speaking firsthand to the people who say, well, tell me about what didn't go wrong then. But it's this glossy sales pitch, looks good, feels comfortable, easy win. We don't think we've got the experience in house, so we'll just do what every other company is doing and buy in the experts. Does that answer your question?
Any more questions in the room?
So keen on your feedback, just for feedback. This is actually the first time I've given this talk, so any and all feedback is useful, as well as if you want to put in your feedback what you're choosing to do next, because it's nice for me to see the actions that then people take, right? What have you learned of what you're going to do differently in your job to help you succeed?
Great, thank you so much, Craig. Let's give Craig a big round of applause. Wow, I don't know about everyone here, but my mind is going in terms of applications, things that I can take away and introduce into my day-to-day, some of the things that might help shape some contextual thinking around the changes that are going on in the organization as well. So I found that personally really, really interesting. And I'm actually going to watch back the recording again so I can make notes as I go. So let's give Craig another round of applause and thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, that was wow. So I actually took a picture of all the tools because I knew some of them, but when I saw the list and I know the list goes on, that was just crazy, right? And I want to check some of them out, how they work and how we could use them. So thank you, Craig, again.